Imagine a world teetering on the edge of collapse. Empires in conflict, alliances ready to break, and a single event that sets off a global catastrophe. This is the story of World War I, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. A war that reshaped nations, introduced new technologies, and left scars that we still feel today. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through the causes, the major battles, and the aftermath of a war so devastating it was called the War to End All Wars. But spoiler alert, it didn't end all wars. To understand how World War I started, we need to rewind to the early 20th century, when Europe was a continent filled with powerful empires. The British, the French, the Russians, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Germans, all of them had one thing in common: they wanted to expand their influence. But like neighbors building fences and stockpiling weapons, the tension was building. Add in a web of alliances, and you have the perfect recipe for disaster. Countries had complex agreements. France was allied with Russia, while Germany supported Austria-Hungary. Britain was keeping an eye on Germany's growing navy. It was like a house of cards. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. And that's exactly what happened in 1914. And it all started with this man, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. His assassination in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, by a Serbian nationalist was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and soon, thanks to alliances, other countries joined in. Within weeks, Europe was at war, but no one expected it to last 4 brutal years. World War I was unlike any war that had come before. Instead of quick, decisive battles, the war turned into a deadly stalemate. The Western Front, stretching from Belgium to France, became a maze of trenches, muddy, rat-infested, and deadly. Imagine being in those trenches. Cold, wet, and constantly under threat from artillery or poison gas. You barely sleep, and when you do, it's with one eye open. Soldiers lived like this for months, sometimes years. The weapons were modern: machine guns, tanks, airplanes, and gas, but the tactics were stuck in the past. Generals still believed in cavalry charges against machine guns. The results? Thousands of men mowed down in minutes. The Battle of the Somme alone saw over 1 million casualties. And let's not forget about the introduction of chemical warfare. Poison gas, like mustard gas, turned the battlefield into a hellscape. It blinded, burned, and choked soldiers. And it was just one of many new horrors soldiers faced. While most of us picture Europe when we think of World War I, the fighting was truly global. The Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, turning the Middle East into another battleground. There were battles in Africa as well. And let's not forget the naval warfare in the Atlantic. German U-boats, submarines, became infamous for sinking enemy ships, including civilian ones. One of the most famous sinkings was the British ocean liner Lusitania, which played a role in turning public opinion in the United States against Germany. But America wasn't involved in the war just yet. That would come later, and when it did, it changed everything. In 1917, after years of remaining neutral, the United States finally entered the war. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare and the famous Zimmermann telegram, where Germany tried to persuade Mexico to attack the US, pushed President Woodrow Wilson to act. And when American troops arrived in Europe, they brought fresh energy and resources to the weary Allies. The arrival of American forces tipped the balance. Germany, exhausted and running out of supplies, knew the end was near. By late 1918, after 4 years of bloodshed, the war was winding down. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed, ending the fighting. But even though the guns stopped, the effects of the war were just beginning. World War I left over 16 million people dead, both soldiers and civilians. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and economies were shattered. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war, but it also sowed the seeds for future conflict. Germany was blamed for the war and forced to pay heavy reparations. The treaty created deep resentment, especially in Germany, where economic hardships and political instability would pave the way for another, even more devastating war, World War II. Many historians argue that the Treaty of Versailles and the unresolved tensions from World War I directly contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II just 2 decades later. World War I reshaped the world. Empires fell. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all crumbled. New countries emerged, and the map of Europe was redrawn. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the war was the realization that humanity needed to find better ways to resolve conflict. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, were formed with the hope of preventing such a global catastrophe from happening again. Even today, over 100 years later, we remember World War I not just for its horrors, but for its lessons. The Great War changed the course of history, and its legacy reminds us of the cost of war, the importance of diplomacy, and the value of peace. So the next time you hear about World War I, remember, this wasn't just a war fought in trenches, it was a war that changed everything.